Welcome to the Richard Allen Chase Memorial Award presentation, the first ever. We are delighted that you are here, and we have a great presentation planned for you all. Welcome to our very special guests, Canadian authors Paul Coccia and Eric Walters. Thank you to CANSCAPE, the Canadian Society of Children's Authors, Illustrators, and Performers, for providing this Zoom webinar platform for us to use today. I am Michelle Dimnick, past president of Rocky Mountain Book Award and your host for today's event, which is all done in honor of Richard Allen Chase for his outstanding contributions to Canadian children's literature and Rocky Mountain Book Award. Here to introduce the award is Alice Chase.
I'm Alice Chase. It is my honor and pleasure to announce the creation of a new Canadian Children's Book Award. This award was created by the Rocky Mountain Book Award organization to honor my late husband, Richard Chase. This award will be called the Richard Allen Chase Memorial Award. A Rocky Mountain Book Award statement reads as follows. In memory of Richard Chase, an unsung hero of Canadian children's literature and an outstanding human being, Richard had a matchless capacity to see the good in everyone he encountered. He was the heart and soul of the Rocky Mountain Book Award for 20 years. This labor of love was all done in the name of introducing young people to exemplary Canadian children's literature. Richard will live on in the hearts of readers, including those who don't even know his name, due to his tireless work bringing great Canadian books into the lives of young readers, parents, educators, and librarians. In this spirit, one title from each nominating year, following the Rocky Mountain Book Award selection criteria, will be awarded the Richard Allen Chase Memorial Award. The first-time winner of this award goes to On the Line by Paul Coccia and Eric Walters. Congratulations, Paul and Eric.
Congratulations indeed, Eric and Paul.
I'm Alice.
Hold on a second, Michelle. We're moving it forward for you. There we go.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Alice, for that beautiful video tribute to your Richard and this new award in his name. On the Line is the first book to receive the Richard Allen Chase Memorial Award. It was chosen based on a certain criteria and themes that were important to Richard, some of which were family, friendship, acceptance, and sports and team building. Here to tell you about On the Line, each other tidbits about writing and collaborating are the first-time winners of the Richard Allen Chase Memorial Award for their book, On the Line. Paul Coccia, Eric Walters, thank you. Take it away.
Hi, Eric. Oh, Eric, we've got it in right now. You're on mute. I get to say it. It's not a Zoom event until someone says it.
You are muted. I was muted because I want to not interfere with Alice's message and want to make sure that I didn't cough during it. Because that's something that seems to happen in live presentations. We cough a lot.
And we say, and things happen.
Yeah, we're going to try and avoid too many things that are unexpected, but it's just the reality of live. It was really interesting for me, actually touching to see Richard's picture up there for a while. That smile was so much a part of Richard. He always seemed to be amused by what was going on, and I had the great fortune of spending time with Richard. Over the years, I'd heard that he had hosted over 100 different writers from Canada, from Great Britain, and had brought them around all through the Alberta area, from school to school to school. We had gathered some quotes from people, on Richard's passing, and I just wanted to read one of them because I really kind of like it. Are we supposed to introduce ourselves first, Paul? Should we do that?
No, we'll do it second, Eric. You're
Let's do
on
it
a
second.
roll. Well, let's talk about Richard. And Alice is here with us today.
Because this is about Richard. Here's a quote that I love. Not many men could be called beautiful, and yet this is who Richard was. His whole being seemed to be in service to others, especially children and youth. Literacy was not a word in Richard's life. It was an action and a way of interacting with others to enrich their lives. His unpresuming nature, his wealth of knowledge about books and authors, his often dry and incredible wit, his kindness and his willingness to do what needed to be done, mostly in the background, and his wisdom were so appreciated. You are missed, Richard. That's a quote from Joanne St. John, who was a former Rocky Mountain Book Association committee member and Our Choice book reviewer. I just thought that really summed up how I remember Richard. I had the great pleasure of Richard driving me around. And Richard was famed for, I think, two things: loving literature and loving shortcuts. He seemed to have a different place he was going to go continually and a way to get there. And I'm not even sure these shortcuts were any shorter.
They were certain, Eric, eh?
Some say were shortcuts. I'd be driving with him and we'd be going down these roads and I was there when it was pretty dusty. And we're leaving behind a dust trail behind us because I think he liked roads that weren't paved. My guess is he liked roads that weren't even marked on maps. I expected at some point we're going to get out, pick up the car and walk across a creek. That we're going to go through a herd of cattle or something, because his shortcuts were phenomenal. And when I talked to other writers about that, who had the pleasure of being with him, those are the things. Great conversation and strange shortcuts that went together.
And Eric, upon receiving this award, so many authors and illustrators have reached out to us with their own Richard stories about coming to Alberta and Richard arranging tours for them, making sure that they got to the kids. I think Lana Button might even be in the audience today. And there's a story about her in a sinkhole where she had to get to school and there was no road and Richard got her there. She was a little bit late, but she got there.
Did he pick the car up and walk over the sinkhole? Because I think he would have done that to get somebody to their school on time.
Power of his will and his mind, I think.
His commitment to literacy and to literature and to young people is quite phenomenal. And I think we've got to get those in mind. It wasn't just literature. It was literature for young people. He was a believer in the fact that there was a book for everyone that could maybe change their lives and make their lives. And as a teacher, as a librarian, he always wanted to get the right books in the right hands at the right time.
And to receive an award that's in someone's name is particularly meaningful. This is someone's legacy. This is someone's family member. This is a loved person. There's a story about Richard where he saved a fawn from a barbed wire fence that I like. We got told this story. And I thought that shows an immense amount of kindness, but even to keep the doe, the mother, calm enough to allow you to touch its baby in distress, that shows a special kind of person. So it's a huge honor to receive this award in his name.
It definitely is. And part of the legacy for us is receiving the award. The unspoken part of the legacy is that literally hundreds of thousands of students across Alberta who got to know him through his work as a teacher, but also through his work with setting up the Rocky Mountain Book Award. These are people whose lives were changed, because I believe as a writer, but also as a social worker, that books change lives. And he was part of getting those books into people's hands.
Not just changed lives, changed Canada. He's changed things for authors and illustrators. He's changed it for readers. To give the right person the right book, especially at a young age, can change their life.
And you said about changing writers' lives. I would not have been able to be a professional writer if it wasn't for the Children's Choice Awards. Their promotion of Canadian books enabled me to have enough exposure to actually write books and create the books that I did, because people like him were out there promoting them so avidly. And they're Canadian stories. There's nothing wrong with American stories or British stories, but they talk about how kids need to see themselves in stories. They need to see Canadian stories because they're Canadian kids. They need to be able to see their own lives expressed and the places that they know and the things that they're familiar with. And Richard endorsed that. He was a patron saint, not just of those students, but of writers.
And Eric, I think you have a similar quality there. And to win this award for a book like ours, where it's queer content, to get the reach that we've got on this book, thanks to you, thanks to Richard, there are a lot of people seeing themselves, or seeing not themselves, but someone they love reflected in a story.
This book, again, on the line is a pretty important book, but people often see parts of books and think that's what the book's about. So this has a basketball on the cover. On the line is a basketball term. It's not a basketball book per se. There's baking it. It's not a baking book. There's gay content, but that's not what the book is about as much as it's about family, accepting, inclusion, allyship, and people finding who they really are. I think those are what the concepts of this book is about.
Now, Eric, should I give the intro of you now? Are we at the right point for it?
But we've got the order right at this point. Ladies and gentlemen, we didn't follow this script, which you're supposed to, because basically Richard's the star of this presentation. And we wanted to put him up front because Richard is what this is about. That's why we're here today. That's why thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, young people across the province were there, because Richard had a vision and he helped exercise that vision through the Rocky Mountain Book Award. So please, if you want to introduce me, then I'll introduce you.
Just one thing first, Eric. Let's just note that 3 years after his passing, Richard is still gathering people together. He's still bringing them together with books.
No question. That's part of his legacy.
So I will introduce you, Eric, and this is my great pleasure because you're one of my favorite people. Eric Walters is the author of, I think it's over 140 books for young readers right now, including the Governor General Award winning The King of Jam Sandwiches, which you've said is your most personal work to date. Eric is a member of the Order of Canada. It's the highest ranking title a civilian can receive in our country. It's for his work in children's literature and literacy, as well as his philanthropy, especially with Hope Story, your orphanage in Kenya. And Eric, I know you're known for your epic school visits as well as your books, and you're a favorite of other authors and illustrators for uplifting all of us in our profession.
Thank you very much, Paul. Those are very kind words. I was actually dealing with the orphanage today. For those that don't know, I'm co-founded and helped set up an orphanage in Kenya. We have over 300 kids involved, and we've had 88 kids now who've graduated from high school, university, and community college. It's amazing to see. So I get to introduce my co-writer, my good friend. Paul is the author of Cub, the player in his newest, I Got You, Babe. Paul is a Master of Fine Arts from the University of British Columbia in creative writing. And yes, he is a baker. There's a lot of baking in this book. And I got to tell you, the baking scenes, those are his scenes. There's no question. He lives in Toronto with his 3 dogs and a parrot, which is a strange combination. Recently, Paul coined a term for a new type of writing called gliterature, as a self-proclaimed author of it. And maybe if you could talk about the launch of your newest book, that might explain that term a little bit more.
Sure. Well, my younger brother is one of Toronto's headlining drag queens. And so for this book, it just made sense that we went off to have a drag performance. So a lot of other authors and illustrators, Barbara Reed, Teresa Toten, Sharon Jennings, Lana Button, all came out for a fun night where we got to see performance, rhinestones, there were sequins. It was just a fun time. And for a very fun book, it made sense to do. So
people were thrilled about the book launch, because often book launches can be very, I'm looking for a polite word for boring. Boring is the word I'm going to. And certainly that wasn't boring. And anyone who knows Paul knows that boring is not in his.
It's not me, Eric.
Who you are. When we do things together, Paul will often dress very colorfully and with lots of extra stuff, and he draws attention. I sit there looking very what was the word you used for me? Boring, bland,
White bread.
White bread. That's me.
Yeah.
That's me.
Eric, you know what? You draw people in other ways. I have to get the fancy sunglasses.
We all do things like that. I actually think we have a couple more quotes from Richard that I think would be nice to work in here before we talk more about On the Line. Because I keep wanting to go back to Richard, because that's what this is about. On the Line is won that award, but let's talk a little bit about Richard again. There's another quote that I love. The best story I ever heard about Richard was when a child, on seeing Richard, ran up to him, threw her arms around him, and simply sighed, "Oh, Mr. Chase, what stronger testament could you get for professional success than those unsolicited adorations of a child?" He was in there working with kids on a daily basis for I don't even know how many years he was teaching, but that was his life. That was his profession. We've got one other quote that I'd like to read. This is from a colleague at the Canadian Children's Book Center. Richard was such a wonderful, kind man. And there's that word coming back, kind. I was lucky to work together with him on Book Week for 8 years. When we announced that we would not be able to offer honorariums to our coordinators in 2002, Richard was one of the first to reach out and tell me he would happily continue to coordinate the tours without any honorarium. Book Week was important to him. His dedication to and passion for children's books was so inspiring. I will miss working with him dearly. That was Shannon Al Barnes of the Children's Book Center program coordinator.
Eric, you have a
Yes.
story about Richard and a spirit of adventure with a tiny little plane. Are you going to tell it today?
I think I should.
I think
I
you
was-
should.
I was touring down in the Lethbridge area, and I had to get to Calgary for my flight home. And the time seemed to be ticking away. I was starting to get a little bit nervous as we went from school to school at the end of the day. And Richard, of course, had a shortcut. And that shortcut took us through, I swear, must have been farmers' fields, dodging cows. And we end up at the Lethbridge airport. And Richard's all happy, and the pilot knows Richard. At this point, I don't know this is the pilot. This is a young person. I thought she was about 14 years old. And I thought, oh my goodness, she's very young to be a flight attendant when welcoming us onto the plane. And it was the 14-year-old that kind of threw me, because she couldn't have been much older. And Richard greeted her and said hello, and they chatted for a while. And this plane is slightly bigger than the car he drove me in. And we get in the plane, and I can easily touch my elbows on both sides of it. And he waves goodbye, and he's off there at the side of the runway with his car, because he basically drove his car onto the runway, it seemed. And that very young 14-year-old, who I thought was a flight attendant, was actually a very, very young pilot. And I got to take off with a pilot who I swear wasn't old enough to drive a car. But as Richard had said, I'll get you to Calgary on time, don't worry. And she flew me to Calgary, got me there, and I caught my connecting plane to get back home. That was Richard. The whole time when I was worried, he was reassuring and calming and smiling. I assume he didn't smile sometimes, but I don't think I ever saw him when he wasn't smiling.
And the best adventures, Eric, often come out of places we don't expect them. I never expected to write with you, and we got a book.
That's part of this whole thing that people find our book. Maybe if you talk about the book for a bit, Paul, then we can talk about this whole process of how we came together to write a book and how the writing process works as a pair.
Sure. So our book is On the Line. And in On the Line, Jordan, a 13-year-old basketball star, just wants his parents to stop fighting. That's how you pitched this book to me when we started talking. And his parents do stop fighting. And he finds out it's because they've separated. And later he finds out the reason that they've separated. And this isn't me ruining anything. It's on the back of the book. So, there's still a bunch of surprises and secrets. The dad reveals to him that for a while he's known that he's attracted to other men, and he's gay, and he can't be a good husband, and he can't be a good father while keeping this a secret and denying it. And that's where the story takes off. And Jordan ends up, I would say, quite angry in the book, Eric, that the person he thinks is his father is just different than what he thought.
Mm-hmm. I think he's angry and betrayed. As we said, this isn't a basketball book, but there's a theme of basketball. The father was a basketball star, was Jordan's coach, and played ball with him a lot. The family's into basketball, and the parents never fought when there was basketball involved. And even the choice of name, he's Jordan, named after his parents' favorite basketball player. Of course, MJ, Michael Jordan. Recently, I was doing a school visit, and I was talking about the greatest basketball player of all time. And I said, who would that be? And somebody put up his hand and said, Michael Jackson? I said, no. Michael Jackson was a great musician, but we're really not playing with the basketball player. That's Michael Jordan.
Now, Eric, you do have experience coaching basketball, and don't you have a story about Steph Curry?
Well, I coached at the highest level in the country. My AAA basketball team was the Ontario champions on 2 occasions. My son was on the team. But one year we finished second because Steph Curry, whose father's playing for the Raptors, he ended up playing for a team called Toronto 5-0. And Steph dropped 36 points on us in the finals. aside being an incredible basketball player, he's also one of the most polite, respectful, well-mannered young men I've ever been around. Like there was no question he was going to grow up to be the person that he was, because he was practicing everything at that point, not just his basketball skills, but how to get along with people, how to be a team player. And that may be one of the themes of our book is team. Being part of a team, getting along with people, learning how to understand and appreciate people, and raising them up, which is what good teammates do.
And a family is a team, and a community is a team. So team building takes place at all areas of human life, at every level that we interact with others.
Definitely. Paul, who was your favorite character in this book?
Eric, you know it's Brody. So this is a fun part of the book where I think you and I saw a bit differently on this, because when I write a book, one of my things is, what can I do to make the character's life more difficult? Because that usually makes a more interesting book for the reader. So I said, let's introduce the dad's boyfriend. Let's have his dad have met someone. They've started up a relationship in the period of the separation. And so my favorite was Brody. Brody to me was a character who is very aware of things going on in an empathetic way. And he understands that people have emotions that aren't always positive emotions. And so he was my favorite.
He was on the same road as Jordan's father, but was farther down that road, so could look back with some hindsight and some understanding of what Jordan's dad was going through. It's funny you talk about adding some conflict, making it more difficult. One of the things I have to do as a writer is, because my characters become so real to me, I often want to almost spare them of emotional turmoil. But you don't have a story unless you have conflict, unless you have that turmoil. I've always got to be careful not to rescue my characters too soon in the story, to let the conflict build.
And Eric, I just like to, jab at them a little bit. I'm like, what could make this situation worse? And I think that when we approach the climax, I said to you, it has to be Brody. From the very beginning, I always said it had to be Brody. And you have different ideas for the climax. And I said, Brody is the last person Jordan would ever want to see. And that's why I want to put him in that scene.
And that's part of the writing together. You have to you got to trust your writing partner to understand that some things are going to come out of left field that you may not even agree with initially. You've got to be honest enough to say, I'm not sure about this, but you've also got to be trusting enough to say, let's give it a shot and see where it goes.
So let's actually talk about co-writing, Eric. How did this story start? You had an idea.
Yeah, I had an idea for this story, and I knew Paul through Canscape, the organization that's writers are involved with, and we'd had some conversation. I think I might be able to work with this guy. This story has some nuances that I think he could really add to a story. I've co-written before with Teresa Toten and Deborah Ellis and Kathy Kaser. I'm now co-writing with Wally Shaw and Lana Button. I like co-writing. I like the process. But I'm also careful who I choose to co-write with. And I came to Paul and said, here's the basic idea. This is the acorn of my story. I want to know if you're interested in this. And I also wanted to figure out if we could write together. Within an hour of sitting down talking, I had no doubts that we could write together. I had no doubts that this would be a genuine partnership.
And I think a lot of people see us and they see two very different people. There's a lot of things that make us different, but there's a lot of things that people see us together and we're the same. We're both tall, Eric.
Yeah, well, tall is a relative thing. Hanging around with NBA players, you're actually very short.
Oh, I'm very short next to a basketball player, but you're about on the shorter end, but you could pass.
I kind of look like a basketball player. It's funny when we wrote scenes. I've got to be honest, we co-wrote the book, but the basketball scenes are basically mine. And the baking scenes, they are completely Paul's. The only thing I have to do with baking is I eat baked goods and that's it.
So you knew when something was delicious. That's all I need.
That's all that's really needed. A partnership that works often is people having shared sort of values of understanding, in our case, the writing process, but bringing different parts of it. I think of my wife and I doing crossword puzzles together. We have very different knowledge bases and understandings and background information, and together we do very well. And this story is a better story than I could have written by myself, a better story than Paul could have written by himself. It's the the sum, the total is greater than the pieces that went into it.
And Eric, you are an exceptional plotter. So when we started, you had the plot nailed down.
Yeah, I'm a plotter. And I'll say to kids, when you go on holidays with your parents, they don't say, come on, get in the car. Do we own a car? Does anyone have the keys? Does anyone know how to drive? Where we're going? Who's going with us? How long we're going for? You have a basic understanding of the trip. But that doesn't mean the trip is going to go the way that you think it may go. If you're driving along and you see something amazing, you stop to look. Your GPS continually adjusts and finds better routes. If I'm driving along with my family and suddenly the bridge in front of me collapses and the GPS says, I don't say to them, I think I can make it. The GPS says go this way. Hang on.
If you're Richard, you might have done that, Eric. You might have said, let's try it.
I don't think Richard ever used a GPS. It was all sort of memorized back routes. It's funny. I was driving in Nova Scotia on a tour and I've got my GPS telling me where to go. And it says in 100 meters, turn right. What it didn't tell me was that there was a river and a small ferry I had to get on before I could make the right-hand turn. Now you think it's crazy. No one would actually drive into the river following their GPS. Go on YouTube, look up things. You'll see people with their dash cameras listening to their GPSs and driving into rivers and canals. So while we plot, was a basic idea, you're not limited by the plot. That's just your initial things. And this story evolved in a lot of different directions than our original plotting.
And I'm a character-driven writer. I think the first meeting where we actually sat down together, and we only actually sat down face-to-face once, Eric, because of
During the
pandemic.
pandemic.
I came to you with 5 pages of questions about the characters. I needed to know things like when the parents met, how old they were when they got married, how old they were when they got Jordan. When I write, I need to figure those things out so I know where I'm starting with characters. And then I know how they will act in any given situation.
Yeah, and I tend to be more plot driven. I like stories to move forward. And my characters tell a story, and I love to develop the characters. And who you start with and who your character ends up is very different. When you're writing, for all of you, keep that in mind. Your character is going to evolve, and you're going to be writing something and think, oh my God, my character does this, or he likes this, or doesn't like this. And I go back, I have a separate page for every character, and I add those details in. And then the next time through the book, the character changes based on those new things. And we should talk about next time through the book. How many drafts did we do of this book, do you think?
How many didn't we do, Eric? Every time we wrote, we went back to the beginning. And part of doing that is we went back to page 1 and we looked at it and we changed things going forward. So that first chapter was looked at easily 50 times, I think.
I think that might be fair. The process we do is a writing, overwriting. That's a term I use. I don't even know if that term exists. And it's sort of an editing, but for the sake of argument, I think I wrote the first chapter. And then Paul read my first chapter, made changes, wrote things into it that he thought were better changes. And that's the editing process. Then he wrote the second chapter. I then went back and looked at the first chapter that he'd made changes to, made some minor changes myself back through there, then read his second, made some changes, wrote it, and wrote the third chapter. They then went back to Paul, who read the first chapter, the changes he'd made, the changes I'd made, the second chapter, his chapter, the changes I'd made, he made changes on that. The third chapter, he made changes on mine. He wrote the fourth chapter. It came back to me. I read first, second, third, and fourth. It's a detailed process, but there's no book that you're going to see in the library that's published that hasn't been edited 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 times. That's the process.
And each time we went through, I know you would do this and I would do this. We looked at what the other person was trying to achieve and helped them get to where they were going as well. It wasn't making changes because I thought I was right and better. It was going, I can see what Eric's doing. Let's just tweak it.
Yeah, and you can't take it personally. I think when I started writing, when I got my first edit back, it was like, the nerve of that editor to correct all my things. It's no different than when your teacher corrects your work and says, these are changes. Your teacher's not trying to make changes because they're bored, underworked, or fully integrated the curriculum. It's to make a better product. That was the process all the way through. Paul's suggestions on my stuff were trying to make what I'd written better, to fit more. And it's a strange process when you get to write a book and read it at the same time. So I'm writing it, but I'm also reading stuff that Paul's doing. I'm being surprised and astonished by some of the changes. And that's such a beautiful process.
And it's a great way for people to learn. I really recommend, even as just an exercise, is get one of your friends that you know you can trust. And why don't you try writing something and then let your friend write the next sentence even. It doesn't have to be a chapter. It can be 2 sentences, and see what they change sentence to sentence.
It was an exercise I used to do with my class, actually, where I'd have 2 kids on 2 separate computers on other sides of the classes. And they could have complete conversations with each other, but they had to do it in perfect dialogue format. And they'd write a sentence, bang, send it over. The other person would do an editing of that sentence, write back a response sentence, and they could talk about anything they wanted. It improved the quality of the writing, helped them to learn dialogue format, which is important. You've got to have a format when you're doing dialogue. And dialogue, while Paul's character and I'm plot, dialogue is such an important part. Those are the 3 basic elements. You got character, you got plot, you got dialogue. And I think our dialogue is very realistic for a number of reasons. We were overwriting it to each other. We're reading it to each other. We also did 2 oral edits. Can you explain to them what an oral edit is, Paul?
Absolutely. So we weren't able to sit down face to face. So part of what I like to joke about this book being called On the Line is how much time we spent on the phone speaking to one another. So On the Line could be us just going, "Hi, Eric, how's it going? Let's talk about the book." So what we did is we grabbed the books and we read them out loud to each other. So the first time I read it through, and it took us 2 days to go through the book carefully. And the second time you read it through. And I know this, Eric, because the first time I lost my voice and the second time you lost your voice. So the last few pages, each of us croaked out a few times. But we needed to hear it, to hear the problems with the way that the story was being told, to hear the repetitions, to streamline it and make it better for the reader.
There are a couple of things you'll find when you do an oral read, and I suggest that for everybody. Before you hand a story in, read it out loud. What you'll find is that there's some words you get attached to, and you'll find that that word is there more often than it should be. And when you read it, you don't see it. When you read it with your eyes, you don't see it. When you read it out loud, you see that that word keeps coming up, and you can eliminate that word. You also find that dialogue can be real or not real. People do not talk in complete grammatically correct format and then wait for the next person to talk and wait for the next person to talk. We talk in fragments. We interrupt each other. Like we do in this thing. Paul will cut me off. Sometimes I'll cut him off. That's okay. That's the way actual dialogue is. I say that we have been a reading animal for probably about 300 years. This whole idea of converting these symbols into messages in our brain, this is a fairly new phenomenon. Prior to 300 years ago, hardly anyone read. We have been a listening animal since our existence started on this planet. So dialogue that looks right with your eyes is wrong with your ears, and your ear will hear what your eyes can't see. That oral read makes the story so much better.
And Eric, dialogue and someone that you love, because you never actually said who your favorite character is. Your favorite's Junior.
I love Junior.
Part of it's the dialogue. He's very snappy.
Junior is funny and ambitious and never takes himself too seriously. He's the sort of person you'd want to have as a friend. Who would want to have Junior as your friend? And Geordie's a great guy, but Geordie's pretty serious. And there's not much serious about Junior.
So let's talk about On the Line and what it means. So I'm going to move to the next slide for us, Eric.
Okay. This is obviously
this is your slide.
On the line. Taking free throws. I hate taking free throws. I got to be honest. Not as much as the Raptors hate taking free throws, because apparently they do it worse than me, judging from their last game. Everyone's standing there looking. You've got a free shot. They call it the charity stripe. If you make the first one, the second one isn't as pressure, but if you miss the first one, hitting that second one is so important. I hate being on the line. On the line is the theme here. The father was also a basketball star during college, during university. He's still on the line, though. He's a supervisor in a car plant. Have you ever been in a car plant, Paul?
You know, my uncles all worked in them, but they never allowed us in.
Yeah, I've been on the floor of car plants. They're noisy, they're chaotic. People are yelling, the sound of the machinery. It's very impactful. It's coming at you all over. It's sensory overload. It's funny, the only thing you ever hear people certain amount of swear words on an assembly line. That's the only words you seem to hear most of the time. This particular plant where the father's been a supervisor, his father was a supervisor there. He was a union representative. When the father became a supervisor, it's sort of his father thought he was going over to management. He was on the enemy side. This is not a new plant, though. We had to picture what the plant was, and it's actually a very old plant. If we move to the next slide, Paul.
Absolutely.
We picture it as being an old plant, and there was reason behind that. In the story, the plant is going to close. Now, this is for generations, people are there. You look at auto plants, it's somebody's working there, their father worked there, their grandparents worked there. Often the kids think they're going to work there. Plant closing down is a major blow to the entire community. And we pictured a community as being Oshawa, Ontario. For those that don't know Oshawa, it's just outside of Toronto. Oshawa was the home of General Motors. It was 3 production lines, giant plants. It was the heart and soul of Oshawa. And then, as in the story, the car plants closed down. 3 shifts became 2, became 1. Different plants closed. It has an effect because it's not just those people that work at the plant, but those people whose kids go to schools and have teachers and you buy in stores and they have storekeepers. The entire economy is built around that automobile plant. And the closing of the plant is devastating to the community. One of the factors in this book is they're really worried about where the money's going to come from. How are they going to survive without him being a supervisor in the plant? He does have one asset, though, that's interesting, which is the next slide.
Hold on for a second, Eric, because something you touched on is really important as it relates to the Richard Allen Chase Memorial Award, which is you talked about the grandfather and the father, who's Chris in our book, and then Jordan. And it's the idea of inheritance and what we leave behind for each other and the things that they pick up. And so that's a perfect segue into the next thing, which is the thing that Chris has taken from his father, Jordan's dad, has taken from the grandfather.
Yeah, this is the car that the grandfather, Chris's father, drove, and he actually drove it into the ground. It was in pieces. And Chris and his father had a very conflictual relationship. Chris wanted to be, for Jordan, different than his father was for him. He wanted to be there for him. He wanted to spend time with him, play basketball with him, and to be supportive. And I think he really was a very good father. He is a good father. It's funny how we look at how we're treated by certain situations and we either repeat them or we consciously decide to move beyond it. That was what Chris was doing, was trying to be a better father to his son than his father was to him. But this car becomes very symbolic. He takes this derelict car that meant so much to his father and makes it back into pristine shape. Throughout the town, because everyone knows everybody in this town, people see this car and they know exactly who's driving it. It became part of the legacy of his father, of the car plant, because that car was built in that plant, and something that was really valued by Chris. But when we're talking about money being tight, this car is worth a phenomenal amount of money, $221,000. At a time when money is short, this car could solve a lot of problems. But can he give it up? There's also an incident where this car becomes a symbol. The father has come out to the community because everyone in the community knows everyone. And then something happens to the car. Paul, could you tell us about that?
Someone vandalizes it, but they don't vandalize it in a little way. They scrape right down into the metal of the car. So the readers who have read this book will know this. They write a message onto the hood of the car. And they want that message received by Chris, because part of it is the anger at Chris for coming out, but another part of it is the anger at Chris for not doing more to stop the car plant from closing.
Yeah, there's a lot of anger in general. I think this was devastating to Chris to have this happen to him, because he was somebody who really worked hard to not only be a good father, but be a good person in the community, to be good to his employees, to try and do the right thing all the time. For Jordan, this was more confusing. It's almost like his father was just such a great father that when this all happened, he felt a sense of betrayal, that his father hadn't been honest with him. But in reality, his father hadn't been honest with himself. He'd been hiding a big chunk of who he was for so many years. Can you imagine having to hide who you are? How devastating that would be?
And that's on the line, Eric. And online has a meaning that I think is the next slide. So there it is.
Yeah, on the line. To personally assume or expose myself to some risk, danger, responsibility, I'm putting it on the line for you. It would have been so much easier for Chris to just not talk about it, to maybe wait for the plant to close down, to maybe even leave their small town and go to a bigger city where he could disappear. But he'd been hiding this for so long. It wasn't just that Jordan's word is betrayed. He wasn't just betraying his family. He's betraying himself, his true self, who he was. And that would be hard to live with. Jordan didn't understand that first. He saw this from his own perspective, which I think we all do. We see how it affects us. And that was the dominant thing for Jordan. Why did you do this to me? How is this going to affect me? What are people going to think of me? And he had to move beyond that. That's part of the transference in this book.
Now, Eric, I've told you this. One of my favorite authors is Jeanette Winterson. She's a British author. She's a postmodernist, for a fancy word, who writes novels for adults. And one of the things that she writes into every novel of hers I've read is, you only risk what you value. And for Chris to risk his family and to risk Jordan, Jordan is the person he values the most, Chris wouldn't have another choice than to put his son at risk. And he understands that he's doing this, but he doesn't know how to live differently and how to be a good father going forward without having that level of honesty with himself, with his family, with his son, with his community.
Mm-hmm. And while some things change, some things don't change. The way Chris feels about his son, his sense of integrity, the way he deals with people in general. Chris is always a good person. And this was just him feeling that he had no choice at this point. It was finally time for him to be honest with people. Because it wasn't just that Jordan felt badly when this came out. It was that Chris felt badly for having to hide this from his son, from his wife, from his community for so long.
From people
Chris
he loves. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
From people he loves, Eric.
Yeah.
But this isn't really, although it's Chris's story in some way, it's really Jordan's story. And part of Jordan's anger is everyone's telling Jordan, you should support your dad. You should be happy for him. You should do this for your dad. And Jordan's going, my family's just fallen apart. Like, it's been destroyed. And that sucks. And that's kind of why Brody's my favorite, because Brody's really the one who says, it does suck.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Other people are trying to make it better. And that's also a message for people when you're dealing with people who are going through trauma. It's okay for them to feel sad or angry or upset. And all you can do is try and be there to support them, but not tell them how they should feel or what they should believe or what they should do. People have to come to those conclusions in their own time, in their own ways, as Jordan does in the end. He really grows throughout the course of this book.
And I think the next slide is a little bit about the idea of allyship. And I think I call it allyship when I talk about it formally, but really what we're talking about here is friendship. So, yep, I was right. It is the next slide, Eric. This is PFLAG. Now, PFLAG, I did a little bit of research before the presentation. It used to be an acronym which meant the parents, friends, and family of lesbians and gays, but they've since broadened and become more inclusive with who they are. So the acronym no longer exists. Now, they are a group of people, and all they are people who care for their lesbian, gay, trans, anyone in the LGBTQ plus rainbow. It's someone that they love. And we all love someone. We all know people. And the interesting part is when we talk about allyship, it's usually said that the allies are over there and they support a community over here. And the queer community is not like that at all. The allies are part of the LGBTQIA. There's more than one A. One is for allies. And that's why they start the Pride Parade every year. They start marching to say, we're proud of the people around us. We're proud of our relatives. We're proud of our friends. We share in the pride that they share in. We love them for who they are.
Mm-hmm. Loving people for who they are is pretty important. And we get down to the themes that really matter in this book. And it felt so good for this book to win this award, because I think Richard would have been proud. Richard was somebody who believed in inclusion. He believed in community. He believed in friendship. Those are the foundations of who he was as a person. And I think this book very much is built on those themes. If people ask what this book is about, it's not a basketball book. It's not a baking book. It's a book about community, about pride, about acceptance, about understanding, about family. I think Richard would have really liked this book.
And there's the cover. Eric, I couldn't let the cover just be a basketball. I had to put the rainbow on it.
It only seems good. Couldn't you get some glitter on there? Is that possible to get some glitter on there?
No, it became a little distracting, but I could put the glitter on there.
Maybe later.
Maybe later. I think the rainbow's just perfect. And it is a book that, in some ways, it's a queer book, but in a lot of ways, it's not. This is a story about a family redefining who they are and realizing that although things on the surface change, and we know more about each other and we grow and we develop an understanding of who the other people are, that doesn't destroy the core unit.
It doesn't. Chris is still his father. Jordan's still his son. They're still a family, even though they're separate and no longer apart. Those things haven't changed. The father and mother still have a strong bond and a commitment to the son. The essence of who Chris is still the essence of who Chris is. He's the same person. He's the same kind person. He's the same generous person. He's the same basketball star. He's the same father. Those all are exactly the same.
And that's a hard thing to write, actually, is to put characters, usually we want to see a change in books. Usually a character starts at point A and you want them to go to point B, and Jordan does. But it's hard to do that and say, well, what do we keep the same at the end of the book? How do we show that there's been a change? How do we show that things have progressed when we're also trying to say things stay constant in some ways?
Mm-hmm. There is a constant to the book in terms of who the father is, but Jordan evolves. And as our main character, that's part of a whole book, is you need to have people evolve and change and grow. I said I like to rescue my characters earlier. There were points that I felt so sad for Jordan through the anger that he was feeling, through the grief that he was going through. And he said some pretty hurtful things there, which wasn't like who he was, but he was responding to being hurt so badly.
And that is the idea of legacy, which, as I said, ties into Richard. What do we leave behind? What do we leave that's better than what was there when we started?
Mm-hmm. I feel very proud of this book. I'm so pleased at how well it's done. The comments we've got from young people. I'm proud that we were able to share this book, Paul.
I am too, Eric, and to get to work with you, I thought was the biggest reward. But one of the biggest rewards beyond that is getting to meet the readers and getting to see the people it's affected. And we've been stopped by more than one person who has shared with us, this is our family story. When we were writing this book in the very early stages, you said to me, okay, go and think about it. We've talked now, you go think about things. So I did some research, and there's very few books where a parent comes out and that actually deal with the kids maybe aren't happy about that.
Mm-hmm. And it's okay to not be happy in the initial part. It's like part of it, we're dealing with a separation. His parents leaving each other, not being together, the dissolvement of the family unit is painful enough at any point. There was that added element of him feeling his father had betrayed him. And I think Jordan also had initially some embarrassment. He felt upset. What will people think of him?
And part of that is the idea of a man. And that was the very first conversation we had together, is when you're dealing with a male world like basketball can be, although Tammy upsets the apple cart there, or the car plant can be, or his relationship with his father or the grandfather even. It's how do you be a man when the idea of what you think a man is has changed so drastically and perhaps been undercut in some ways?
Those are very key elements to this book. I hope people who haven't read it will have a chance to read it. And I would encourage people who are in the audience today, If you have questions about this book, if you have comments you want to make, Paul and I love getting emails. Please feel free to email us. I can be caught at ericwaltersauthor@gmail.com. Paul, what's your email?
Mine goes right through my website. There's a submission form, Eric. So if you go to www.paulcoccia.com, you can send me your questions right through the website. It's nice and easy.
And we will guarantee that we will, in fact, answer them. I've been doing school visits for 25 years. I've done about 12,000 presentations. And when I go to schools, kids will say, I sent you an email. And every time I can say, and I answered it. Because it's important for us as writers to honor the people that read our books, to answer your questions. And we'd be more than willing to answer any questions you have about this. Paul and I are both actually going to be out in Alberta in September. We're going to be in the best word on the street in the entire country in Lethbridge, Alberta. And that's the 23rd. I had to look at my calendar. The 23rd of September, Paul and I are both going to be out at Word on the Street. As I said, the best, better than Vancouver, better than Toronto, better than Halifax, better than anywhere. The Lethbridge Word on the Street. If you've got an opportunity, you should get your parents to bring you there. And we're going to talk individually about things, and we're also going to share time talking about this book. And for people who are interested, both Paul and I are going to be doing some touring. I'm going to be out in Alberta until the 27th of September. Traveling to schools, doing visits. If you're interested, email teachers, more than willing to come out and visit your school. In-school visits are spectacular. And while we're doing this virtually and we're trying our best, we love being able to be in schools and talking to kids.
It's very hard to sign a book virtually, Eric.
It is. But
Now,
please join
we
us.
have some questions as we're coming up to the hour, Eric. So I'm going to jump into one of them. Are we planning to write another book together?
I hadn't thought about one way or the other. What do you think, Paul?
I'd love to write again with you, but there aren't any plans right now.
No, we've got to find the right topic is what it comes down to. I'm writing a picture book right now with Lana Button called One Can. And it's about a food drive, which I'm really pleased with. And I've got a book coming out with Wally Shaw called Call Me Al, which is coming out next year. I like the co-writing process, and I could see Paul and I writing at some point again, but nothing in the plans.
What was the worst part of writing a book together? This has been a hard one for us to answer, but I've got an answer, Eric.
Okay, give me your answer.
When we had to stop writing together, it was the worst part.
Well, it was like the process of reading a book or having a great meal. You don't want it to end. And so the process became so much a part of our daily lives that
for about 3 months.
Yeah. There was a small part in the middle where I had to say, Paul, we've got to stop this, because I wrote a pandemic book during the pandemic. So I had to take, I took 11 days off to write that book.
Yeah, you told me it was, you were taking a vacation or a break. And I think I told you, Eric, that's not a break. You're going and doing more work.
It was a story that had to come out. That book, from the time I thought about it till the time it came out, was 41 days. It was digitally released, and I was writing for 14 to 16 hours a day. That was a marathon.
Now, one question we do get a lot, the end of the book, who won the game, and why didn't we write that in?
I don't know. Who won the game, Paul? I have no idea.
I think, well, it's up to the reader at this point. Who won the game? It's the question I would ask them. I have an answer for why we didn't write an ending that was more conclusive that way.
Mm-hmm. What's your answer?
The characters were complex, and Dr. Rob Bittner, who is the foremost doctor of queer children's literature in the world, said that the characters were beautifully broken, and to tie them up neater would have been a disservice to the story and the characters. And that's my answer. I stole it from him.
I think that they won regardless of the score of the game. Jordan's evolution and his relationships with his father and with his friends, he'd already won. I don't like "and they lived happily ever after" stories. I like to leave it where you get to write the last chapter yourself and you can figure out what's going to happen. It's the same reason I don't like to have a picture of somebody on the cover of a book, because then that becomes the image that you see as the character. I like you to figure that one out yourself.
This is me being a lit theory geek, Eric, because I do love that sort of stuff. When we talk about books, we're always supposed to talk about them in the present tense. And it's because when we talk about them in the present tense, it's because we're experiencing them as we read it. So that's the logic behind it. Now, the thing that actually shows is how important the reader is to defining a book. The reader is an active participant. It's not like watching TV. How you read, how you interpret, that changes a story. So the reader is as important and as powerful as the authors, I would say.
So far, we haven't got anyone who wrote the last chapter for us.
I'd
If
like
you're
to see
interested-
that last chapter.
Yeah, if anyone wants to write the last chapter about how the game ended and what happened, please feel free to write it and send it to us. I'd love to see that.
I always had an instinct that Tammy and Jordan weren't completely done with each other.
I can't imagine they would be.
No, they just seem tied together really well.
What's going to happen from there is we have an idea of what we believe, but it isn't important what we think is going to happen next. What's important is what you think is going to happen next. And that's where, as Paul said, you bring you to this story. You're the one that decides the next steps.
And with that, let's invite Michelle back on.
Come on back in, Michelle. We should also, before Michelle speaks, we should thank Michelle. Michelle has been instrumental in all of this and setting this up, for inviting us for the award, for her help with the Rocky Mountain Book Award over the years. Thank you, Michelle, for all that you've done for the years past and for what you've done today in setting this all up. Thank you.
And there's a lot of volunteers behind these awards.
Yes.
There's a lot of volunteers, teachers, librarians getting the books to the readers, and the readers themselves deserve a thank you.
Well, honestly, I was inspired every day, every time I met with Richard Chase. He was absolutely amazing. One of his favorite things to do, as you mentioned, was to drive authors, illustrators all over the province without a GPS. He was so happy when he could get great kids and adults together with great books, Canadian books. And I think that thanks to you both, thanks to Alice Chase, thanks to Rocky Mountain Book Award, oh, he's gone and done it again. What a huge legacy he has left. And I do think that he would have loved your book. I think that he would be very proud to see that he's still influencing great books and great kids. I can't wait to see you in September. I want to put this label, this beautiful Richard Chase label on your books. I'm going to have a whole bunch ready to just sticker up all the books you bring with, because, well, congratulations. You are the first, and we are just, Rocky Mountain I speak for, we're just absolutely thrilled that you could do this today and that you could bring Richard and his legacy and his passions to life again today.
Now,
Thank
Michelle,
you
we
so
do
much.
have 2 more surprises in our slideshow.
Oh, surprise
We have the
away.
book trailer, so let's play it. But there's the logo for Rocky Mountain. Let's get through the slides. I'll do it nice and quick. There, Eric, is your book, which has won. It's a gold medal award winner, Rocky Mountain Book Award, Safe as Houses. It's the
one. I love Children's Choice Awards. I love them even when I lose them.
Yep. It's also up our books, and Eric, you're a favorite of the Forest of Reading for good reason. Your books are great.
I love those awards. I actually say that I'm the biggest winner of Children's Choice Awards in the country. I'm also the biggest loser of Children's Choice Awards in the country. I've lost more than anyone else, but you get to choose. That's what makes it special.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, everyone from Rocky Mountain Book Awards, and Alice Chase, a very special thank you for creating this award in Richard's name.
Thank you all. Thank you, Richard.